So hello, my name is Natasha Marrus. I'm a child psychiatrist at Washington University in St. Louis, where I've been attending since 2012. My clinical work primarily involves doing early diagnostic evaluations for autism spectrum disorder, as well as working in school consultations for individuals on the spectrum. I enjoy working with this population very much because I think for both ASD and ID, social communication and adaptive function are something that cannot be taken for granted. And it provides a lot of learning opportunities to work with these families and individuals to boost their learning and to see how they work with their environment and how they can use their strengths to get the environment to work with them. So in this lecture, I just wanted to give a few pointers up front. So as we may all know, transitions involve change processes, and there are many change processes throughout the course of development. The transition planning that is going to be discussed here in this lecture and the related factors involving IEPs is going to focus on the transition from adolescence to adulthood. This is one of the big issues in transition planning that most people mean when they talk about it, and it certainly has come to the fore more and more, particularly in more recent decades when more and more research has shown there's a high risk of post-secondary outcomes for both individuals with ASD and ID, and certainly in regard to the rising prevalence in ASD that started about 10 to 20 years ago, which now means we have many more adults with ASD who we're aware of. So for my disclosures, I have a Career Development Award from the NIMH to study the early development of social motivation as related to autism spectrum disorder. So there are 4 objectives to this lecture. The first is to conceptualize transition planning as a goal-based process. Both of those points, goal and process, are going to be very important, as we'll see. And certainly a transition planning that's effective is not static or cross-sectional. It's something that's responsive to the changes in the individual and the changes in their environment. Next, we'll identify challenges and positive predictors of transition for individuals with ASD and ID. Being aware of these is very important to crafting an effective transition plan. Next, we'll work on developing a framework for integrating care providers and services in transition planning, and thinking about this area as one in which hopefully there'll be some principles that can be applied to a variety of stages of transition. And then finally, to recognize legal issues impacting families as children with ASD and ID age. Certainly the balance of authority that families must consider as children move to a stage of wanting more autonomy is something that is very prominent when working with these populations. So here I have a definition of transition planning as far as bridging childhood to adulthood. And it's the process that uncovers, develops, and documents the skills, challenges, goals, and tasks that will be important to move from childhood to adult services. So there's a lot of key points in here. Again, that focus on process. This is not just a one-time deal. It involves a lot of time before and it involves a lot of time after. And it's also kind of a journey of discovery. Everybody's an individual, and certainly getting to know that individual and to know what works best for him or her is an important part of developing this plan, as well as understanding the challenges that are going to be faced and the goals that will ultimately be reached for. An important thing to remember about transition planning is that ideally it's collaborative and goal-oriented. So it certainly takes a village. It involves the individual, the family, the educational system, vocational agencies, other advocates and supports that child and family may have in play. And I find that when working with families and patients, it's important to emphasize that they're not alone, that it is a team-based effort, and that it will involve some effort on their part, but the more they reach out, the more they'll be able to benefit from all the opportunities which are available to them. And throughout the transition planning process, students and parents will be introduced to services, activities, instruction, supports, information about opportunities for accommodations, and so there will be a wealth of information, but it can occur step by step and in that way be much more manageable. And post-secondary goals are going to be guided by certain information, by data. And these will generally include assessments that look at the training that the child has received until that point, their education, what employment experiences they may have, and their independent living skills that they've been able to develop over time. So I mentioned how transition planning is certainly a journey and a process. And one thing that I find that can be reassuring to families is to remind them that if they're already talking about it and we're discussing it as part of the patient's clinical care, the process has certainly already begun. So what can seem overwhelming is something that's already in process and for which milestones have already been met. And really, the beginning is going to start when the parent has the awareness to notice that there's something about how their child is developing that's provoking concern, that's making them wonder whether the developmental expectations are being met. And then for many families, we know there are barriers that they have to surmount in order to get the screening and the assessment and ultimately the diagnosis that will kind of provide the key stepping stone to being able to access a lot of the services that would be available. From there, there's certainly a process of interventions. This can happen clinically, it can happen educationally in the school, it can happen with other service providers, and it's an iterative process. And so even though there's this ultimate goal of transition, transition is kind of unfolded in that iterative intervention process, along with the monitoring and the reassessment and the revision that's going to come gradually over time. And again, reassuring families that they're on the journey, that it's a stepwise process, it kind of unfolds. It's not something they have to take in all at once, can be really helpful, I think, to keeping motivation up along the journey and to keeping them calm and reassured enough to be able to incorporate the child in that process. So I mentioned at the start that transition planning over the past few decades has become something that people are much more aware of as the risks of poor post-secondary outcomes have become increasingly clear. There's more and more work in both ASD and ID that's documenting these risks. And so using data from the National Longitudinal Transition Study, which looked at students' progress between 2000 and 2010. These were folks who had been enrolled in special education to see what happened to them as they transitioned to post-secondary outcomes. And what's been found is that certainly employment rates are lower for individuals with ASD and ID. So for ASD, 34.7% had attended college and 55.1% held employment in the first 6 years after high school. So there you have both lower rates of post-secondary engagement as well as employment. ID has a similar pattern with 18.2% attending college and 68.9% holding paid employment in the first 6 years after high school. And so obviously if we think about transition as having an opportunity for maximized independence, those numbers are certainly something that we can see room to improve on. And it's also worth keeping in mind that individuals with ASD and ID showed lower mean wages than those with other developmental issues who often get engaged in special education, such as specific language impairment, emotion disturbance, and learning disability. So again, there's more work to be done in understanding these populations and making sure that transition planning is well managed. Other work on outcomes has been done looking at community samples. In this sample of about 300 individuals, adults were studied in the community as they went through that transition process, starting with adolescence and then ultimately afterwards. And what was found is that adults certainly face significant challenges. And this was true for both ASD and ID, but especially for ASD. Challenges included very limited social integration. Individuals with ASD tended to be overeducated for their jobs, and so that's related to the kind of the concept of underemployment, where abilities and performance aren't being matched in the environment. They had high rates of mental health problems, as well as evidence for declining adaptive function over time. And so that's what this graphic here shows. So on the y-axis, or excuse me, on the x-axis, there's age in years, and on the y-axis are scores of an assessment of adaptive function, looking at daily living activities. And so in blue are individuals with ASD, in red are individuals with ASD and ID. And one thing I think that's very interesting and telling to note is that the individuals with ASD without ID show a pattern of increasing growth in activities of daily living in adolescence and early adulthood, but then they plateau and seem to decline in later adulthood. So there is evidence that certainly something is occurring later in life where certain skill progressions that perhaps were being shored up earlier in life with more supports are not being maintained. And so again, it brings to mind the whole point that setting a good foundation with a good transition plan has the potential to be helpful in the long run. And so one thing then that everybody would like to know is what are predictors of improved transition? Because the more that we know about these, the more we can try to bolster these earlier or sooner rather than later when dealing with our patients and our families. And so this study was very interesting. It was a systematic review of the literature in which 16 evidence-based elements of positive transition planning were reviewed. Effect sizes were calculated for how much these led to improved outcomes in 3 areas: education, employment, and independent living. And then each of these different aspects of intervention were given a score of either moderate for showing reasonable evidence of leading to improvement, or potential, where there was perhaps some evidence, but it was not considered quite compelling. And so looking at which of these predictors were ones that did have pretty reasonable potential for leading to improvement, you can see the moderate ones are going to be highlighted. And so it's things like inclusion in general education, paid employment and work experience, self-care and independent living levels, vocational education, and a transition program. And so one thing to take note of with all of these more strongly impactful aspects of intervention is that they're very experiential, in that they kind of give the learner a chance to experience elements that will be common in their adult life. And so I would say that in my clinical experience, this has been true as well. I've noticed smoother transitions when the parent and child can work together on building experiences that involve opportunities at employment, volunteering, getting out in the community, knowing what a more integrated environment looks like. And so that's definitely something that I emphasize with families as worth thinking about, and definitely being something that can help promote a smoother transition and better outcomes in the long run. And examining predictors also gives us ideas about what can be some best practices for transition plans. So there's been a great deal of work done in this area as well, and a few different ideas, but overall some consensus on what best practices would be. And these apply to a broad variety of populations, but certainly to ASD and ID as well. And so one example is student involvement. So it's very hard for anyone to be invested in their transition plan if they don't particularly know what it's about, don't particularly feel that it aligns with their interests. And so ways to assure that doesn't happen is to have the student involved in keeping with their abilities as early and reasonably as they can be. And I do encourage this with my families, and I do see that it makes a difference. The children are more invested, their motivation is more maintained, and it actually gives us opportunities in the clinic to talk about what they think about how their planning is going, which can also help crafting steps for later parts of the plan. Another important point is parent and family involvement. That was noted on the previous slide as something that can be a potential predictor of better outcomes with transition planning. The parents and families are going to need to provide the support that's kind of kind of the engine. For a lot of these individuals with ASD and ID, communication, motivation, being able to advocate for needs is something that's a huge hurdle and a challenge. It's part of the symptoms that they may experience. So having parent advocates and families who are very supportive is absolutely essential for being able to make sure that the plan takes off. Earlier I mentioned that there are a lot of other components, other agencies and providers who are involved with transition planning, and the relationship with those people is also extremely important. So how well the family interacts with the school, both the family and the student, is very important. How much do the family and the student feel like the school hears their concerns, respects their opinions, works together with them to act on steps in a plan that seem reasonable and well matched is definitely key. Also key is a meaningful curriculum focused on vocation and academics. This is a common challenge I see in my work with school consultations. Many times families and schools run into issues as far as how much the curriculum should be balanced between vocation or more functional daily living skills versus academics. And so certainly it's a work in progress. I've found that the more there's communication about goals and assessments, the more seamless that balance can be. And then finally, transition planning, as I mentioned earlier, is a goal-directed process. So student-oriented, outcome-based goals and goals that are measurable are certainly vital to helping the transition plan be effective. If you don't know where you're going, it's going to be very hard to get there. So definitely having those anchors for the plan is essential. So in addition to those practices then, there are also ideas about principles. And again, these principles can apply at various stages throughout the lifespan in terms of any transition. So planning should be individualized. So taking into account all those best practices and having all the components of the machinery worked out well, the eye should be kept on the ball in terms of who is this individual? What does this plan mean for them? How does it fit with who they are and the environment they're in and the supports they have? One-size-fits-all approaches generally don't work. And so as a clinician, I think the time that we spend getting to know these patients and families can be pretty valuable for communicating, where we see the individual strengths or where we see potential challenges. And oftentimes in school consultation work, I'll be communicating with the school about that as they go ahead and work on elements of planning. Planning should be strength-based, aligning with interests, abilities, and desires of the individual. Again, if the individual isn't invested in the plan, either because it doesn't fit with what they care about or what motivates them, because it doesn't give them the opportunity to express strengths that they may be very proud of, it's going to be very hard for that plan to sit well with them and to be executed in a way that's productive. And so, people need to be comfortable in their own skin and to know that they're doing something meaningful. So that's an important element of planning as well. Planning should identify clear long-term and short-term goals with measurable outcomes. This point will come up again and again. It's certainly come up in the educational literature. The ability to have those goals as anchors and guideposts is important for everybody engaged in the planning, so they know how to effectively put forward their resources. And the measurable outcomes are clear as well, because in order to figure out whether goals are being met or are still appropriate, being able to measure them is important as far as feedback and taking that in and deciding what to do next. And planning should also document specific strategies, service providers, and means for addressing changes. So again, planning is not static. It is a process. It's not a cross-sectional thing. There will be changes. There will be strategies that evolve over time. The better those can be documented throughout the planning process, the better the understanding of the individual, and the more likely the goals are to be a good fit. So the transition plan then will involve a lot of different elements. So there's all these ideas about principles and practices, and at the end they're being funneled towards certain categories of issues and goals. And so post-secondary education can be one potential area to think about, as well as occupational planning, training in additional areas such as social competency or independent skills, housing options, medical care, in particular mental health care for these populations is also important, and then guardianship and legal issues, given that the autonomy and the level at which the individuals will be able to navigate their environment may be something where more longer-term parental or family support is needed. And with all these multiple different areas of planning to be coordinated, a team, a multidisciplinary team, is very helpful for part of this process. And so this would include many players that have already been mentioned, obviously the patient, student, the individual, parents, teachers, including both special and general education teachers, any therapists who are involved. Case manager is very important if that service is available, and I do tell families to take advantage of that. They can really help navigate resources that might seem very intimidating or threatening at first. And then outside agency representatives, in particular when it's known that a child is going to be moving to another outside agency after they make the transition. It's very important and helpful for those folks to be getting to know the child in advance so that they can be prepared to work with them as they move into adulthood. There's a history behind IEP guided transition planning, and so this whole lecture kind of frames transition planning in terms of IEPs, and these IEPs were rooted in the special education movement that began in the 1980s as a response to the poor outcomes that were being noted for students with disabilities, and certainly students with ID at the time were a huge part of evidencing the fact that more needed to be done to improve outcomes. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA as it's commonly known, did mandate transition services. This is the same wonderful law that also mandates other aspects of special education, such as the IEP itself, free and appropriate public education, and other things that give psychiatrists the advantage of being able to ensure that their patients are getting the environmental supports that can help them. IDEA has been reauthorized several times, and in 2004 it was actually renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And part of this renaming was intended to reflect that there is a results-oriented component of transition services that was being emphasized, that there was room to grow on this, that there was more opportunity to measure goals and outcomes, and so that's one of the reasons why that's a point that's been coming up again and again in this talk. One thing to note about IEP-guided transition planning is that the IEP is there for the child prior to transition, but after that adult period, should the person or individual go on to post-secondary education, at that point different legal mechanisms take over, and that's where the civil rights legislation, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, start to have the weight to encourage colleges and other institutions to provide access to curriculum or other aspects of the environment as a means to have no discrimination being at play there with these populations. This does mean that for that post-transition phase, what you often find is that either the individual or the advocates working with them will need to be more proactive as far as talking to institutions and ensuring that supports can be brought to bear in the person's experiences. Now, at its most basic, the IEP is a document. So that's really the most concrete thing it is. It's a written document required for each child who is eligible to receive special education services. And there are certain requirements with this document, and these requirements make this documentation very valuable. So they include present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, measurable annual goals, special education, related services, and supplementary aids and services, and transition services by 16 years of age. Previously, it used to be 14 years of age. It was advanced to 16 years of age. This is something that isn't necessarily seen as a totally positive thing by all. In general, earlier starts are better. It is important to keep this number in mind, though. Folks who have an IEP should be aware that there's this transition planning piece coming. If they're not, that's a breach of understanding that should be repaired, because it's part of the legal requirements of an IEP, and so it's absolutely, it's absolutely key and something that the learner should be receiving by law. There are additional legal requirements that involve exactly how that IEP transition plan is carried out. And so these things include age-appropriate transition assessments. They should be related to training, education, employment, and independent living skills. Meaning what level of function is the child at? What skills do they have to bear? How are they growing into adulthood? That's one area where assessment can be really valuable in terms of setting goals. It should also include a summary of the child's academic achievement and functional performance, including recommendations, appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, transition services aligned with goals, and communication to the child that rights under IDEA will be transferred to the child at the age of majority, which is generally 18 years of age. And why is transition planning so important in light of the IEP? And there's a few reasons in addition to the documentation that itself provides tremendous value. But one is that IEP, by working with the child over time and seeing them progress to adulthood, has the opportunity to balance individualization with normalization. And that's certainly key to laying the groundwork for somebody to function effectively in the community as an adult. It also facilitates the smooth transfer to adult services. This can be through the meetings that are coordinated with outside agency representatives, as well as the fact that the documentation in the IEP will be used to document the eligibility for those adult services. And after age 21, an individual must be declared eligible for services from adult service agencies. So that technical issue is something that folks need to be aware of as well. Now, as far as the role of transition assessments, I've mentioned that knowing the learner's strengths, weaknesses, interests is an important part of helping to individualize goals. And it avoids the pitfall of having students be fit into existing programs that may be, again, attempts at one-size-fit-all, but could just not be a good fit for the person. And ideally, multiple informants should provide data. Individuals with both ASD and ID are sensitive to their environments, and so a multi-environment perspective is extremely helpful. One other point to acknowledge regarding assessments is that they are very important in highlighting strengths and needs. So this graphic was from a study in which teachers filled out transition planning inventories on about 100 students with ASD, ID, or both. What it shows is different levels of function over on the y-axis there, like communication skills, self-determination, employment experience, and then the percentages of students that fell into certain categories with each of these different areas of strength or ability. Black indicates that a certain percentage of students showed high needs, light gray indicates that abilities were mixed, and then darker gray indicates that there were strengths. And so what one can notice up front is that even in these populations, it's not like everything is a weakness for everybody or everything is a strength for everybody. There's variation. People are individuals. And so assessments can allow you to fine-tune the plan to figure out where a person would benefit most and also what areas can be capitalized on to promote better function. And the authors did in fact confirm as well that students in general were very individualistic in their profiles. So 2/3 of the students had entirely unique profiles from anybody else. So again, just some nice data to show that the importance of looking at the learner for who they are. A variety of supports and services can be found or can be implemented to target different areas identified by assessments. These should be coordinated, results-oriented, and focused on improving academic and functional achievement. They include things like instruction, that can be in a variety of areas, community experience, development of employment or other post-school living objectives, services to promote acquisition of daily living skills. That adaptive functioning piece is very important, and a functional vocational evaluation. And so having an awareness of these different types of service opportunities is very important for families. I do see patients and families who aren't aware that these options are open to them and that you can tailor them to what the person needs and or wants. And so this is something I do emphasize with my families. Now, moving on to the different options or activities that can happen after the transitions occur. One important area that comes up a lot is post-secondary education, college education. What's going to happen with that? And so there are groups of students who will be pursuing post-secondary education options, and it's important to identify a program that's most in line with those goals. There are several aspects to consider with that. I would say proximity to family in my clinical experience is highly important. Family has been generally very important prior to the transition, and I think part of easing that transition can be figuring out to what extent the family is available and accessible to the student or learner as they move to more and more adult levels of independence. So how close the school is pretty key. The number of students and class size is also important. What are the opportunities for individualized attention? Are there any risks of overstimulation in a particular environment? The type of degree is also important. For some learners, a 2-year program might be a better fit in line with the goals for additional learning and later occupations potentially. For others, a 4-year program might be more in line with what they need to enhance the skills that they're hoping to attain. I have seen families who will choose to lengthen out that transition by using a 2-year community college as a stepping stone that can offer proximity to family as well as a more gradual stepping up of academic demands and then moving on to a 4-year college. So that's one strategy that I've found can be helpful. What's the level of school supports and extracurricular opportunities that the institution offers? And with the extracurricular opportunities, I think it's important to think of, again, how good of a fit are they with the patient or the student? Is this the sort of extracurricular social opportunity that is going to be something that they find very easy to participate in, or is it going to seem intimidating or off-putting? I found that sometimes families don't have an awareness of that up front, and I think it's very important. I have seen patients struggle with that, and so being able to anticipate that up front is very helpful. Arranging for school support services in advance is always a good idea. It's always better to be prepared if possible. And again, keep in mind that the student themselves will need to take a more active role in that. Many of these schools will provide the student to initiate that or will require the student to initiate that. So that is something to counsel families about and to talk with the patient about and make sure that they're ready and comfortable to do that. And all of this, of course, offers an important opportunity to develop self-advocacy, which is a key skill of adulthood in general. Being aware of the variety of post-secondary education models out there is also something to counsel families about. There's a range, and this theme will come up again when I talk about employment opportunities. In general, there will be at least 3 tiers, ranging from something that's perhaps very inclusive and integrated and has the opportunity to be individualized, but may not have a very specific program base or something that's very well concrete and clearly established with lots of steps. And then there's other programs that can be definitely more regimented, more focused on building skills specifically in populations with developmental disabilities, and therefore can be more separate. Again, the individual will dictate which environment is most comfortable for them. Now, as far as occupational considerations go, it's important to remember that individuals with ASD and ID are employable in a variety of businesses. I have seen a lot of very concerned parents who need a lot of reassurance in that regard. It's not that it's easy necessarily to go and find all these opportunities, but I think it's worth reassuring them that if they look, there are opportunities out there, and there are ways for individuals at a variety of levels of ability to contribute and to obtain gainful employment. Communication skills, interpersonal skills, and management of stereotype patterns of behavior is very important to contributing to employment success. All of these things will facilitate being included more naturally in a broader environment. And so again, having these things in mind as transition planning services are being coordinated is a good idea. As far as job searches go, it can be very helpful to think about what makes a good job, or what kind of jobs look good. Because if you're applying for the wrong sort of job, that may not go well and may not be a good use of one's time. So kind of like with the transition plan, it's good for jobs to have goals. A goal, an endpoint, a function that's pretty clear to the individual so that they can have an anchoring as far as what their role is and what's expected of them. Ideally, the job would involve strengths and abilities that match well with the student or learner. So this can be something to keep in mind, looking for a job that the strengths that are required are something that the individual has. The level of support in the environment is also something important to consider. Environments that that recognize that there can be limitations, but that there are also accommodations and ways to include everybody and ways to build on strength can often be a better fit than a place that is going to have more ideas about exactly how things should be and how well the person fits in their system versus how well the system can work with that person. Doing online searches myself with families, I found that words like disability friendly can often be good buzzwords to look for. Work environments can provide a range of support. This is again similar to what I mentioned with the post-secondary education options. Again, there's a range. At the most stringent level, it can be competitive employment, a full or part-time job. There really isn't a set program in place to offer any sort of long-term support. The person's integrated. For some folks, this can work well and be very comfortable, and they have to be aware of their own comfort level with that. There's more supportive employment where there's going to be ongoing training and perhaps some personalized support even in that competitive employment environment. That can be a nice middle ground. And then again, there's going to be more secured or kind of separate employment models where the work area is more self-contained. Again, the person may be spending more of their time working with other individuals with disabilities. And again, for certain folks, this can be a very comfortable level that really allows their skills and their socialization abilities to grow. To obtain successful employment, there are things that folks who are working with individuals doing their transition plan can certainly help with. Self-awareness about what type of work environments might be suitable, what types of interests the person has can be extremely valuable to talk with. or to talk about with patients so that they kind of know what they're looking for. Teaching as far as interview skills, manners, knowing how to look prepared for a job interview can also be very helpful. These are abilities that often do not come naturally or readily to folks with ASD or ID. And so some coaching in that up front can go a long way to conveying the skills the individual can bring to the table when they're meeting with a prospective employer. Helping the person have all their documentation together. That's something a lot of us don't know about till we actually do it. So being able to educate the person that this is something you can do to prepare and this is something expected can make that process easier. And certainly teaching interpersonal skills and being upfront about working with employers to see what accommodations are available can also be very helpful. There are a variety of workplace accommodations, in fact, that certain employers will offer, and so this table lists a few of them. These range from things like ongoing skill assessment, certain aspects of modifications to jobs to make them more accessible to the individual, building in routines, for example, limiting transitions, where reasonable, reducing social demands. These are things that kind of have little flavors of what sorts of accommodations are offered in IEP in an IEP, and so some of these can be translated to workplaces who are receptive. The level of supervision that will be provided is important. I have seen this be an area of conflict in some of my patients where I really felt like they could do the job. I felt like the environment was overall hospitable to them, but if the supervision was not something they gelled with or understood, the wheels fell off. And so keeping that in mind, who's the supervisor? Do they understand? How do they deliver instructions? What's their own communication skill level? These are things to think about too, and to work on both sides, also with the patient to be prepared. What are the coworker relationships like? Is this a work environment where folks are very open and acknowledging about challenges, or is this a place where everybody's, generally more keeping to themselves and doesn't acknowledge differences in people? Certainly more open environments tend to be more encouraging. And then the level of support services. Is this a workplace that understands that there might be needs to de-stress, opportunities to offer sensory supports, job coaching opportunities? These are all things to inquire about and to be aware of as being out there if the workplace allows it. All right, so now for housing. So another key area. The data suggests that the majority of individuals with ASD in particular are going to live with their parents. And so for ASD nor ID is there going to be a ton of independent living. That being said, with the spectrum broadening for autism in particular, more adults are living outside the home. And so this issue does come up more and more as far as what are the living situations open to them. And so again, this is an area where planning that involves the individual, the family, case management is extremely helpful and important. The range for living arrangements, like everything else, is broad and does exist. There can be independent living. Again, that does tend to be less common, but it is happening more and more. Then there are various levels of supported living, including the option of living with parents. So again, family would need to be brought into that conversation as far as what works well, what's sustainable, and what's sustainable as far as how boundaries will be negotiated as the child moves to adulthood and is developing more and more autonomy. And then at very high levels, there'll be supervised group home living or a personal care home or a nursing home facility. So again, knowing what those options are, getting on wait lists, having the case management in place to help with that is pretty key. Case management is often done at the adult stages through a supports coordinator who designs an individual support plan. So this plan is very helpful. Again, documentation of exactly what supports are in place, what are the goals, what are the issues that are involved with the individual that are being worked on. For those with ASD and or ID, the supports coordinator will work from the Office of Intellectual Disability. For those without ID, states may provide some special funding or waivers, so this is one area that will need to be looked into on a case-by-case basis, and so ideally, or state-by-state basis rather, so ideally family should be aware of that option if that's something that they're interested in, and talk to local agencies that know about this. The ARC chapter, for example, in the community would be one place. Medical care and mental health care for individuals with ASD and ID as they transition to adulthood is additionally an important consideration, and one area that has been coming to light as very poorly executed. Medical care is complicated, fast-paced often, communication can be difficult. Child psychiatrists can play an important role in facilitating that communication, transferring records, being liaisons with other providers to understand how medical comorbidities interface with psychiatric issues and comorbidities. And so that's something that definitely we should be mindful of. All right, and so for the last part of the talk, guardianship and legal issues as well as financial issues. At the age of majority, generally 18 years, individuals with ASD and ID are going to be legally recognized as adults. So what this means is that parents cannot make decisions on their behalf after that age if they haven't assured that guardianship or some other mechanism for specific aspects of decision making is in place. What this means is that parents can lose access to medical and educational records if, for some reason, the child isn't able to communicate effectively that that's something that they still want. And so this is an important milestone to prepare for. And it's important to strike a balance between ensuring health and safety while also granting the new adults and the independence and autonomy that they are able to grow into. Appointment of an individual guardian allows kind of substitute decision-making powers for another person. The person would be the ward. So it's kind of like parenting just keeps continuing. A full-blown guardian is established via a court hearing, and during that court hearing, what will have to be determined is that the ward is not capable of exercising the more standard adult rights due to incapacity or incompetence. And those terms involve this idea of there's an inability to care for self or property or to communicate decisions or needs. This table does list guardianship and alternatives. One important thing for families, especially if they're unsure about some of these things, is to emphasize that there are alternatives. So you have at the higher end full guardianship, which covers medical, financial, residential, and very many personal care decisions. But then you can also have things be more limited. For example, conservatorship that only involves finances. And then there's varying degrees of powers of attorney that can make decisions or that can help make decisions in specific areas, and these latter ones generally don't require a court appointment. When considering which level to pursue, there are a variety of guardianship checklists that are online. This was an example of one that I liked. And basically it probes aspects of adaptive function and asks the parent, family member, caregiver, other person working with the individual, how effective is this person at articulating their needs, understanding information that's presented to them, being able to engage in self-care and make decisions. And it can just be helpful to inventory and see that if a lot of the answers are no, then guardianship is something that is worth considering. Finally, in terms of finances, I've seen many families worry about how to make sure that their children are financially provided for and that finances can be used to help them even as they move to adulthood. And so one mechanism for that that's been put into place is a special needs trust. And so this is a legal device to assure that an inheritance is accessible to a person with a disability when needed. And so it allows families to help manage those resources, but at the same time maintains the individual's eligibility for public assistance benefits, which many of these folks will benefit from having access to. And so it creates a fund to pay for items and services not covered by Medicaid and other government benefits. It should be set up by an attorney, specifically an attorney who has expertise in special needs type planning and estate planning related to the special needs population, because there are many mistakes that can be made in setting up this plan, and sometimes they can be costly to correct. And so at the end, what should happen is that a trustee is authorized to spend money on behalf of the individual. And as far as the planning for such a trust goes, this will fold and dovetail into issues about guardianship, medical decision-making, and finances. So some of the information on slides that came before this. And again, the steps that are important are to find a good family attorney to help with this. And so in conclusion, just a few points about guidance to families. Transition planning begins years in advance of adulthood. It's something that families have already started to do as they're caring for their child with a developmental disability. But it's important to be aware that it helps to start early. A well-coordinated multidisciplinary team is vital to the plan. Working with the team and child to develop an understanding of strengths, weaknesses, interests, and goals is key. There are opportunities for experiences that can translate to expectations that may occur in the future, such as issues of employment and inclusion, and taking advantage of those early is very helpful. And it's important to be conscious of the level of independence of the individual, as this will guide planning related to legal issues and finances as they hit that age of majority. And then this slide just lists some resources for agencies that have put in a lot of work to thinking about transition planning, so they're there for your reference. So thank you.
Dr. Marrus, thank you for that wonderful talk on transition
welcome.
planning. And we have a few questions we want to ask you, if that's okay?
Sure.
Cool. So I wanted to ask, how and when do you advise families to begin transition planning?
Well, as I hopefully stated during the talk, it should start early.
Okay.
Earlier is better. The age of 16, when the school's mandated, is kind of late in the game.
Okay.
By early school age, I will start to talk to families about some of the components of planning that were discussed in the lecture.
Wow, that early, huh?
Yes, but not so much framing it in terms of you got to find housing for your kid now.
Right.
More in terms of these are some issues to think about, and let's think about where they're at in terms of their development and where you might see them going.
Exactly, and I'm sure that families have thought about these things. They just haven't necessarily talked to anyone about it, but they're concerns in the back of their mind.
Well, yes, and so I think having a framework of kind of checkboxes of what could be thought about and what areas to focus on can be helpful. And sometimes people will have an affinity to one more than the other, and so at least they can then get the feeling of reward from feeling like they've made progress in one area and have accomplished that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of beginning early, because that's really a theme in autism, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Yep. So what are the major skills that you want to ensure are addressed as part of a transition plan?
So I think that certainly for both ASD and ID, issues with adaptive functioning are going to be huge. That's going to determine how well the individual can interact and engage with the community later on, and how well they're going to be able to advocate for their needs. So I tend to emphasize that highly in terms of building skills. It's also a very useful way to frame the value of experiences, learning experiences that occur not just in academics but outside academics. For ASD especially, the more nuts and bolts of social communication and language skills are also pretty important. We know that language skills are highly correlated with outcomes for ASD, and so it's very important to make sure that that child has had the opportunity as much as possible to maximize their communication abilities.
Excellent. So we have some families who, are dreaming big for their children, which is always wonderful.
Yes.
But at times, as a child's approaching transition age, we'll see a disconnect between what the parents' aspirations are and what the reality is. So how do you navigate through situations where the parents may be being unrealistic?
Right. I mean, certainly you don't want to remove hope, because hope is going to be an important motivator in a process that takes time and energy. So what I find is I kind of go back to two principles of transition planning. So one is that it's a process. Sometimes when a goal is unrealistic, there's a bit of an element of this is it has to be this, and it's a very static construct. And so helping families to realize, oh, that's very interesting that there's this idea. What are the ways we can take that apart and figure out what aspects of it make sense for the child.
Exactly.
And then the other issue is to go back to that idea of assessment. Well, let's find out more about your child as an individual. Where are they at? What strengths can they bring to the table in terms of achieving this goal?
Yeah.
And then what areas would need to be worked on? And then finally, encouraging them to take a step-by-step approach to having experiences, volunteering at a medical center, for example, if there's this goal that the person has to work in healthcare, for example. The person may find out they don't even like it.
That's a great idea to get that experience.
Yes, get that experience so that they can learn more about themselves and integrate that with the goal.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your talk that some families have opted to do a 2-year college approach. Can you tell me how that might potentially be a great fit for some families?
So it can be a great fit for a lot of reasons. So one is that proximity factor. In general, if you're going to a community college, it's going to be somewhere closer.
Yeah.
So that can be helpful for providing greater avenues for family support.
Right.
I think it allows the person to have slightly less intense academic demands. And so for that young adult, it can kind of be easier to make sure that the skills that they gained in high school can be translated more effectively to a college setting.
And get some confidence too.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It still offers the opportunity to integrate with a broad community.
Yeah.
And the reward of, I think, the 2-year certification, there's something about that. Like it's an easier goal to keep in mind, and then it keeps your options open for kind of deciding, okay, at that 2-year point, do I love this enough that I want to continue with more education, or am I feeling ready to pursue other opportunities in work or volunteering or something else?
Yeah,
So.
that's really helpful. I also wanted to ask you about a scenario that I encounter quite frequently in my practice, which is, let's say I have an adult patient with ASD and ID, and they're maybe in their early 40s, and so therefore the parents are aging and they're getting into their upper 70s. And I'm feeling kind of uncertain about what the plan is. Like they may have guardianship, but right now in terms of housing, they haven't taken any steps. So how do you recommend beginning that conversation?
So that is definitely an interesting question, because the parents I've often found are also struggling with their own ideas about where their lives are going, and even their own issues with mortality. And so you're dealing with the transition the parents are facing, as well as the now adult transition that the child is going to face. I mean, first of all, I try to see, have they thought about it? I mean, I often start with a question, where are you at? If I don't know where you're at, it's going to be hard for me to advise you on where they're going. And oftentimes these conversations can be personal. I have had some fear and anxiety associated with it. But then the other thing is to remind them that there's a community of resources that we can work on to engage. So taking advantage of what they already have, or looking at other resources and assuring them that there is a process that allows their child to be provided for and taken care of, and to have a good quality of life.
Exactly.
So keeping that hope going as well. But also, getting them started on the process of steps that'll help make it work out.
Moving forward. Yeah. Well, Dr. Marrus, thank you for this wonderful talk on the transition process.
No,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.